Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's conversation about engaging Me Too in the Iranian and South Asian diaspora context. My name is Persis Karim. I'm the director for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome today Professors Kasturi Ray and Professor Catherine Sameh. And I'm going to briefly introduce them. And the way that we're going to engage today is to have each of the two speakers talk a little bit about their work and some of how it's indicative of some of these larger questions about gender violence, sexual harassment, and gender exploitation. And then I'll ask a few framing questions, and then we'll allow the conversation to continue with audience questions and participation. I ask everyone to please mute themselves when they're not speaking, and we'll ask people to raise their hand to acknowledge them when they have a question to ask. Our hope today is to generate a very important and relevant question about the Me Too movement and its impact on our respective communities, and also to think thoughtfully and consciously about ways that we can bring this conversation to our respective communities in thoughtful and productive ways. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Kasturi Ray. She's an associate professor and chair of Women and Gender Studies at San Francisco State. It's actually the first time we're actually meeting, and sadly we're not meeting in person. She holds a Ph.D. from Brown University, an MA from UC-Berkeley, and a BA from Barnard, Columbia University. Her research areas of interest include gender, race, and labor in Asian diasporas, social health and sexual freedoms, and abolition feminisms. She collaborated with San Francisco State University's Dr. Santhi Kavuri-Bauer and Dr. Falu Bakrania to write and develop programming in art and representation in South Asian diasporic visual cultures. Her most recent publication, co-authored with our other colleague, Dr. Julietta Hua, is Behind the Wheel: Drivers' Lives in the Age of Uber, which is forthcoming any day, I suspect, from University of Minnesota Press. Welcome, Kasturi. Dr. Catherine Sameh is Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Irvine. She's the author of Axis of Hope, Iranian Women's Rights Activism Across Borders from University of Washington Press. Her research explores gender and feminisms in Iran and the diaspora, social movements in the Middle East, gender and Islam, human rights, transnational feminist networks, feminist responses to Islamophobia, and intersectional and decolonial feminist epistemologies and political practices. And I think in the chat, we have links to both these publications that were mentioned. I also urge you to read some of their articles, which are available on various online sites. So I was inspired to bring this conversation to our respective communities, and I had heard a little bit about Kasturi's work, and I wanted to put her in conversation with Catherine, whose book I had the pleasure of reading recently, just before it came out. And of course, it's all very timely, since this week was a big week for the Me Too movement with the trial of R. Kelly and the judgment against him. And also this week, Tarana Burke's book, Unbound, the founder of Me Too, came out. So women of color, I think, are much more visible today than they were even a few months ago in this whole conversation. So I'm delighted that the coincidence enables us to think critically about what's next and maybe how we can participate more thoughtfully in these bigger conversations about patriarchy, gender discrimination, and sexual harassment and sexual violence. So I've asked the two speakers to briefly present some of their work and how they believe that it touches upon some of these larger questions about transnational feminism, women's status vis-a-vis the workplace, and some of the ways that they're exploited specifically because of their gender, and to think about the legal frameworks that make possible some of the convictions and judgments that have had a real impact, and why those are or are not immediately accessible in some of our communities, and what are some of the cultural taboos and challenges that we have in bringing these conversations forward. So I'll start with Catherine, Dr. Sameh's work first.
Well, thank you so much, Persis, and everyone at the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, Nick and Ariana and Nazi, and just honestly, Persis is such a model of, I think, community building and institution building and supporting fellow activists and academics, and the work you do, I draw on and am indebted to, and I just really appreciate this invitation. And I'm excited for the conversation because I think, as movements and sort of uprisings and upticks unfold, they're just so messy and thorny and interesting and complex, and there's a lot to, I think through. So I'm delighted to see friends and colleagues and co-thinkers here, and I hope that we can have a really rich discussion. I'm sure we will. So briefly, my research considers everyday feminisms and women's rights activism in Iran and the diaspora, and the ways in which these movements both build and are part of transnational networks and modes of affiliation and solidarity. I try to challenge the narrative about Iran as a static space that can only be understood through a repressive state apparatus. I look at women's rights struggles and try to understand and articulate the ways that Iran is a dynamic society with a complex set of social actors who are in different moments able to mobilize, negotiate with the state, be heard by politicians and others in authority, and shape their society and relations with each other. I'm very interested in my book and other work, I explore the dilemmas of transnational organizing. There are so many, and the question of how to create these networks and these connections inside conditions of violence and power, including imperialism, the global war on terror, the weaponization of human rights, sanctions, the demonization of Muslims, and the sort of lingering, persistent neo-colonial representations of Iranian and Muslim women. I try to kind of elaborate how activists are articulating a very strong critique of US empire and holding that together with a critique of patriarchy and legal and other kinds of discrimination in their own societies. So in my work and in response to this really generative invitation to consider Me Too within Iranian diasporic context, I'm interested again in how activists are confronting their particular patriarchal context on their own terms, but also in conversation with global or networked feminist movements and conversations. And I think it's important to foreground the ways in which movements and sort of uprisings and moments like this are connected to a long history of feminist organizing in Iran and in the diaspora, that feminism and the sort of variety of women's struggles are indigenous to Iran, and that Iranian feminists are in conversation with the world, are doing world making of their own, and certainly in conversation with other feminists. So I have many questions, more than sort of assertions. But one question I would ask, and I think it would be interesting to explore, is, and I think about this in my book, is, how do we think about or try to come to terms with the fact that these various movements, Me Too included, are continuing, they're part of older conversations, but they're continuing to shape ideas, grammars, practices around gender, sexuality, intimacy, power, and everyday relationships inside of Iran, the diaspora, and around the world. So I think this is an interesting question to kind of think through, in addition to many other questions. So I look forward to being in conversation with Kasturi and the rest of you. So thank you.
Okay. I wanted to also thank Gender and Women's Studies for co-sponsoring this event, as well as Middle East and Islamic Studies and South Asian Studies, because we want to make sure that we include as many of our students as possible. So I thank my colleagues for also helping us to bring this conversation forward. Kasturi.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine, for being available to be in this conversation. Thank you, Persis, everyone at the center for organizing this. I think it is really important to talk across diasporas, across geographical regions, across political places, to think about what is going on with gender identification today. Where do we cut it off? Where do we allow it to flourish? So I really appreciate this opportunity to think about Me Too as not just something that South Asian diasporic scholars are contending with, but that our comrades in other feminist diasporic spaces are thinking through very carefully. My work with thinking about gender violence began really in, so dating myself, in 1997. I worked with an organization in New Jersey, so Catherine might know about them, called Manavi. Manavi remains a South Asian domestic violence organization. And they helped build in 1997 one of the first shelters that was just for South Asian women and their children. And it was one of the first of the kind. And then now I think it's spread. I have some ties with Narika here in the Bay Area. And you might know that this week, Narika is doing a bunch of workshops with SFSU grad students on ESL language skills, including, I think, yesterday was how to get your driver's license. I think tomorrow is learning about how to pull together a bank account. But Narika and SFSU have been doing a lot of great work beyond this week. But I encourage you to check out their activities. I've also worked a bit with treecone.org, which is thinking about violence against women and against other marginalized folks in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities of South Asia, thinking about ways gender is and is not policed in those spaces as well. And finally, I've also worked a bit with Saki.org, not always pleasantly, but productively. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. And of course, anyone who has tried to research South Asian feminism owes many, many debts to the All Indian Democratic Women Association, which is one of the longest running feminist organizations in the world. So a lot of thanks to researchers before me. I'm also interested in this because Me Too was a victim of sexual assault as a girl child, and have also experienced gender harassment as a professional. So speaking as someone who has been working in this world for many reasons, for many priorities. In terms of my scholarship, I've been so lucky that in my grad studies onwards, I've worked with folks deeply invested in questions of modern culture, media, and power, questions of national identity. I've been very intrigued with thinking about how post-colonial India has made its identity as traditionally Hindu and what that might mean, and how the West is considered kind of a modern incursion, and yet how places like India make sense of this even when they are literally indebted to Western capitalist enterprises. So it's really interesting how authenticity resides often in the bodies of women when we come to thinking about what is truly Indian, but then a lot of the economic arguments and deals that are made often have nothing to do with women. So my research has been very much on South Asian women who have been both freighted with national identity, questions of authenticity, and then I'm also really interested in South Asian women for whom questions of authenticity are lifted. So I spent a lot of my time in grad school thinking about South Asian domestic workers and where their South Asianness was important in terms of getting a job, for being more caring, for example, but then when their claims to South Asian identity are curtailed when they start speaking out against abuses in their workplaces, and then they're considered, not good women anymore. And more recently, I've been so lucky to find wonderful colleagues in women and gender studies who have pushed my thinking about how gender is created in different institutions, especially working with Dr. Julietta Hua. And we recently published a book about taxi drivers, which is a population that is mostly taken up by immigrant men of color, and thinking about their experiences with the incursion of Uber, thinking about ways that the racialization of South Asian men has worked to criminalize them in many ways, and kind of understanding how the gendering of racialized men and women often happen in concert, right? This is not a new argument. Angela Davis was here decades before Julie and me, thinking about how the racialization and criminalization of men and women occur not in vacuums, but within contexts of powerful interests. So it was kind of one of the points of the book that I wrote with Julie on taxi drivers, and kind of my work since 1997, building that South Asian Women's Shelter, is calling out power and seeing who stands to gain with gender violence and sexual violence. So thank you for this opportunity to reignite these questions and understanding their importance in our diasporic communities. I so appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if the two of you might talk a little bit about what observations you've seen in terms of, because the Me Too movement has primarily been a digital or a social media movement, but then the consequences of it have grown into things like important legal cases or women mobilizing to challenge particular cases of discrimination in the workplace. And I wonder if you have any specific examples in the work that you're doing in these respective communities where you've seen some of either the after effects or maybe before Me Too, which Kasturi, you seem to be pointing to in some of the work you did with those organizations that have already identified gender discrimination really effectively, and that perhaps may be able to use the Me Too moment to bring it more in the light of day. I hope that was clear. And in some ways, what I'm asking is, what are the limitations of Me Too, as a sort of hashtag social media movement for some of these communities, and what are the advantages of it?
Well, Catherine, is it all right if I go first? Thank you. Well, I'm thinking of two historical moments. In 2017, law student at UC Davis, Rhea Sharkar, put out a list of academics, male academics who had been sexually assaulting or sexually harassing grad students in India. And when this list hit, I think she put it up on her Facebook in 2017, it was so like this really catastrophic moment in our community, because she was naming like the male leftist academics that many of us had looked up to. And I remember when her list hit, there was this question of whether to support her or not to support her, what it meant for the academics who were named. And then within our activist communities, like some men wondering if they were going to be what they called collateral damage, and trying to really think about what feminism meant at that moment. And one thing that struck me about this is that Rhea said it was because she was Indonesian, her national citizenship, and because she was residing in the US, she felt that she could publish this list. And I have thought about that a lot. I'm wondering what it means to be an outsider and feeling like you are the one who's equipped to do that. So that was a really galvanizing moment. And yet now in 2021, I did notice that the Me Too movement in India, for example, has netted really only one big change in the life of someone who was accused. So a deputy prime minister, Prime Minister Akbar, was named for sexually harassing many young women journalists under his sort of supervision. He's a pretty famous journalist, and he serves in Prime Minister Modi, who's a very controversial figure, his cabinet. And he actually resigned, and he's actually the only one who's received any consequences for being named. What's tricky about it is that he's one of two Muslim citizens in Modi's cabinet. And what does it mean that he's the only one who's actually faced consequences? So it's tricky and involved, and I'm just really interested in thinking about how the Me Too movement can sort of be emphasized by other movements that perhaps are not very liberatory. So here I'll just name it Islamophobia, and how together they might strike in ways that maybe weren't the original intention. So Rhea Sharkar's list named a lot of Brahmin men, men who have caste privilege. And she was talking a lot about how Dalit intellectuals were actually left off the list, maybe on purpose. And I was thinking about her strategy then, and also the horror that these male academics were named for being so significant in the field, but also because of their caste privileges, educational privileges as well. So I just hold those two moments in tension when I think about the productivity of Me Too and its trajectory. But Catherine, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
I mean, I think in terms of the productive possibilities for these kinds of movements and the limitations, I mean, I think we're sorting that out so much, and I don't know that I would call this, I'm not saying you were calling it, primarily or simply a kind of online movement, but I think for the past number of decades, there has been a kind of hybrid nature to certain kinds of uprisings, or, on the ground, and they have a huge mediated component. And I'm really interested in how that's been happening in Iranian diaspora for many decades. And, in what ways is this connected to a lot of that kind of organizing strategy and work that many women's rights activists were doing in, you know, moments where it was harder to be in public and, you know, when the repression, waves of repression that were more severe. So, I mean, this strikes me as different, and a lot of people have written about this in terms of the kind of Iranian context, that the sort of target, or, you know, of critique is not so much the regime, but, you know, other people in everyday life, in the workplace. Certainly, of course, everywhere there's a kind of, you know, focus and more attention on celebrities, but of the many, many cases that you don't hear about, you know, they're often sort of ordinary people trying to have, you know, be held accountable. So I'm not answering it in a very probably eloquent way, but to say that I think we're still trying to understand, both in the Iranian diaspora and also kind of globally, like what is this? Is this, you know, certainly I would say it is a movement. It is a set of, you know, breaking many silences and taboos. It's, you know, it's a way of articulating as individuals, but as a collective, you know, and bringing to the foreground the sort of pervasive global nature of patriarchy and of sexual violence. So, you know, I think part of it is, how do we kind of capture and tell certain stories about what's happening? And I think there are different ways of going about that, and it's kind of difficult to say. But, you know, as in many communities, there are some incredibly difficult conversations about what this is, what are the effects, how to think about this. You know, I think, you know, I'd be interested in hearing from other folks, but sort of thinking about like how do we think about justice in these cases? And of course, many communities and feminists and others have, you know, really provided us with a kind of very capacious idea of justice. So it's not so much about taking people down and preventing harms, but creating a world in which, you know, we build relationships with each other that are based on kind of radical care. And, you know, so that may sound really abstract, but I think that these questions are really in the air. I mean, I would say that I think you know, as many people have said, the collective mass, you know, articulation of the kind of pervasiveness and ubiquity of sexual violence, I think is, you know, that are bringing that to the surface in these different communities has been, you know, really important. So I think, as with any movement, it's sort of like, okay, now what, or how do we kind of think about this, and how do we connect this conversation? I think, Kasturi, you really made a great point, to larger conversations about, you know, who is visible, who gets cast as a kind of sympathetic victim, you know, or case study, right? Who's left out, as we know from Tarana Burke's case, right? Her really kind of coining this in 2006. And so, I mean, of course, that the critique is out there. So I think some really interesting conversations are happening and are widely circulating, that this is both you know, a kind of global phenomenon that's happening in these different ways, and the ways in which it gets represented, or, you know, what happens in these particular contexts is kind of differs, and we have to make sense of that and unpack that and understand that.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just to respond to the suggestion that this type of analysis might be abstract, I also think that it's so helpful to push against really binary understandings of these types of violence. So I think it leads us to ask more questions. So to be more concrete, I don't know if anyone was able to see the film India's Daughter. I think it came out in 2015, and it was a woman filmmaker who interviewed the man who had assaulted a girl on a private bus in Delhi, who later died of her injuries. It was sort of a big case. And it was banned for a while by the Indian government. And they said that the reason for banning it, I just want to get this right, was that the film was an international conspiracy to defame India. And what was interesting about this, well, many things, is I didn't watch the film because my threshold for that had been reached for that story. But what was interesting is the filmmaker was British, born in Israel, sort of did a lot of her work in South Africa. And she was seen as someone who had a Western agenda. And also she interviewed men who occupied a social class much different from her own. And there was a sense that maybe she trapped them or something. And one of the men who assaulted this Delhi girl, the wife of one of the people who was in jail, said at the very end of the film, this part I did watch, that, where is she going to go from here after you execute her husband for assault? What's left for her to do? Because she has no one to care for her. And she's saying, I'm going to have to end up strangling my children, which I doubt. But it was just really interesting to think about how it's so much more complicated. And then when we talk about it being Western or non-Western, we actually protect larger systems of power from being named and investigated. So I think naming someone might not be the end of the story, but just the beginning, like all the resistances around naming or the desire to name, like what is behind that? What are the other interests at play? I think it's just really exciting to think about what's happening in those moments.
Thank you for that. It was kind of a question that was arising in my mind, and maybe Catherine, you could speak to this a little bit in terms of thinking about the struggles of women in Iran, and they have been long and many, over the last several decades. What are the ways that a movement like the 1 million signatures campaign or other attempts for women, some of these human rights lawyers in Iran who've been basically imprisoned for their work around gender discrimination or other forms of discrimination, have in some ways been seen as enemies of the state, or pro-Western and therefore anti-Iranian, or conspiratorial activists, to undermine the regime. And what can we do as outsiders to that, to make sure that people see the complexity of neither dismissing these women's struggles through the lens of, anti-Western rhetoric, but on the other hand, also to recognize that they're working inside of a system that's very different from the one that we're operating in. And I think that's one of the important elements of transnational feminism, is to understand that you can't just take a feminist sensibility or a feminist practice from one place and stick it on to someplace else and expect it to work seamlessly.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question. I think, it feels like a little bit of a different moment than the moment that I kind of explore in the book. But yes, it is true that feminists and others face, not in Iran, not just in Iran, but, many, many other places in the global South, the kind of accusation that, somehow, from those in power and from those in power who have kind of positioned, their particular form of state power as a kind of anti-imperialist, position that, feminism is a Western import. And, I think what we have to do is actually then listen to how activists respond to that. And as I say and try to elaborate those voices in my book, these activists are actually carving a kind of nuanced and complex set of politics and discourses that don't kind of give in to this idea that you can only either critique your own society or have a critique of sort of long histories of US and other Western encroachment, imperialism, colonialism. So certainly in the 1 million signatures campaign, that complex position was articulated, and activists really, again, sort of on their own terms, tried to resist that kind of poverty of choices and articulate, hold these critiques together. And I think we have to do this now with, at least with the representation of, Me Too Iran in the mainstream press. I mean, there's been some sympathetic and interesting kind of coverage of it, but, for instance, the New York Times, one quote, compared with the impact in the United States after the accusations against Harvey Weinstein, the fallout in Iran is only beginning to unfold. But there are signs that the male-controlled power structure in Iran has started to respond to accusations. So, that's one example of how this kind of culturalist discourse is applied to Iran and the Middle East, the Muslim world, other parts of the global South. That again locates this in something in the culture, right? That male violence and sexual violence are inherent to the culture, and as Uma Narayan and so many others have told us, right? That discourse isn't applied to the U.S. or the West. Now, I think the kind of 2017 and beyond Me Too uprisings really, hopefully, it's one of the arguments that I make, that it's sort of, this is one of the moments, and we've seen many over the past several years where US exceptionalism is being challenged, and some parts of the kind of feminist movement in the US had to think of themselves differently, not as inherently rights bearing, but as people who had to struggle for rights, and learn from other parts of the world, who had been articulating and practicing kind of these different movements and these challenges, and kind of having these conversations and struggles around rights. So I think we need to really emphasize that and kind of foreground that yes, there's a way in which Me Too often gets framed. The focus is on the US, or the focus is on these sort of elite white celebrities. On the other hand, the fact that it happened and the conversation then became connected to these older histories is a kind of example of the ways in which patriarchy is alive and well in the US. So, I mean, I think the other obvious connection that we have to connect the dots around, what is the relationship, how is US empire the most predatory force around the world, the most extractive, predatory, violence producing force around the world, that part of the kind of, focus on women's rights in Iran and in other places coming from, you know, all political persuasions, from Pompeo to now the Biden administration. How do we connect that, you know, this kind of women's rights promoters to the imposition of, you know, the continuation of a brutal sanctions regime that's, you know, chipping away at the many gains that Iranian women have made in the workplace and in education, and exacerbating conditions of economic struggle and poverty that we know everywhere make women more vulnerable to domestic and sexual violence. So I think that connecting of those dots has to, you know, continue to happen, that the different scales of violence and what we kind of frame as violence, we have to think in those different scales and make these connections as many people are doing. You know, this is happening also in relation to the conversation about Afghanistan. So I'm pleased that these larger conversations and analyses are happening, but we have to, I think, always, you know, try to connect those dots. And, you know, I'll just say one more thing. One, I think, important thing that's happening in terms of Iran Me Too and the discussions are, you know, there's a huge concern about, again, what is justice and what is it, you know, what does it mean to be part of a society in which, you know, things like rape are punishable by execution. I think we don't want to exceptionalize Iran, but we want to actually make a connection between all of these, you know, societies that are turning more and more into, you know, kind of militarized carceral punishment, you know, as a kind of solution to harm. And of course, abolitionist feminism is, you know, teaching us and articulating that we need different models. We need different models to deal with harm, all kinds of harm and threat and violence and, you know, insecurity that are not about locking people up, but are about kind of radical practices of care. So I think that's also a very important kind of conversation that's happening among Iranian feminists.
I wonder if we could maybe talk a little bit about the ways in which legal frameworks and legal precedences, either in Kasturi, you mentioned several cases. I don't know if there was a trial for that young woman who was killed, but do you see the legal framework changing as a result of some of these cases, either in the Iranian or India or South Asian context? And do you see that as driving some of the cultural change around it, or is it a kind of mutually moving train of change? And is the power of the legal framework essential to actually changing systemic behavior?
I have a depressing answer to that, I'm afraid. I mean, Indian civil law is borrowed from the British, right? And the British went around and sort of got advisors from very elite backgrounds when they wrote up things like family law. But I think it's pretty impermeable to Me Too, and that's because Indian law has a huge investment in defamation. So a lot of activists actually have been held up, not for any other violences that they might incur, you know, on their way to making a statement, but if they defame someone. So Me Too has been effectively kind of blocked, where cases of sexual violence and harassment, violence to the person, often get coded lower than the defamation claim. But what happened in 2020, in February of this year, with the case of the Deputy Prime Minister, Prime Minister Akbar, is that he filed a defamation case against a journalist who claimed that he assaulted her. She was one of 20 journalists who accused him. And the judge ruled that a claim of sexual harassment cannot be used as defamation. So that was very, very weird and groundbreaking. And I don't know where it will stand as a precedent, because precedence takes less weight in Indian civil law than it does, for example, here. But it was a moment where maybe Me Too is not going to be susceptible to defamation laws, which then might crack open an ability to move forward in criminal courts. But right now, reputational status is very much protected, and it's often because a lot of the protectors share the same social backgrounds as the folks who are being accused. I mean, that's what I think, but I think it's an observation that would be hard to disagree with. So right now, the legal apparatus is pretty impermeable to Me Too, I think.
Catherine, do you have anything you want to add in that regard?
I mean, I guess I would just say, probably not helpful. And response would be, I think the relationship of course, laws are important. Of course, legal reform is incredibly important. But as many, again, kind of abolitionists have been raising, that the structure of law contains within it all kinds of other problems and violences, and it's also not equally applied and all of these kinds of things. But of course, we need to battle at these different fronts, I think, to continue to fight for some kinds of both legal protections, obviously, but also reforms, but that the relationship between that and then the kinds of everyday violences is not a tidy relationship. So we see that obviously in the US to a great extent. So I think people are doing really important work, and in the case of Iran, there's a long history of kind of struggle to have the law reflect women's interests and move towards something more gender equitable. That that isn't happening full scale, but there have been different moments of kind of success. But again, I think in the case of Me Too, I think there are just a lot of really thorny questions about what is the desired outcome. What does accountability mean? What does justice mean? And I think these are some of the important conversations that people are having around Me Too in all kinds of contexts. How do we again make connections between different kind of scales and levels and producers of violence? And a lot of us in diasporic and immigrant communities, wrestle, as many women of color in the US do, with what happens when something happens inside of your community and you feel kind of torn. You feel both protective and in some ways you don't want to air the dirty laundry at the same time, as women and other kind of feminized and oppressed subjects. It's also really important to raise these issues and struggle inside of our communities. So, I mean, that is my hope for this moment, that these conversations are happening in the everyday, in interesting and different kinds of ways, and that people are, people become transformed inside of social movements, or can become transformed. And we don't have a ton of models. I mean, we do have, you know, the wonderful work of people like Miriam Kaba and Survived and Punished. And, you know, I think, how do we bring a kind of abolitionist approach to this question, which does not mean abolish the legal system, or, you know, but it does ask, I think, what are we trying to create? What kind of world do we want? What kind of relationships with each other do we want? How do we challenge those inside of our community and those inside of our families, you know, our patriarchal fathers and brothers and people we love and struggle with around these many issues? And how do we, are there different kind of models for thinking about these kinds of everyday struggles? And what do we need to create conditions of well-being instead of conditions of all the kinds of violences that everybody is facing in, of course, unequal ways, but in really intense ways. So.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question for both of you to think a little bit aloud with us about exactly that. How do we confront in our own communities, in our own families, in our own relationships with people, some of the challenging circumstances when people's reaction to us is, oh, that's either so American, or they insult the person who might be harmed by these practices by, you know, finding some way to dismiss them. Because I think that's there's a certain way in which we are sometimes reproducing the same systems that were inherited from our parents or our, you know, homeland, so to speak. And we reproduce it in a myriad of ways in our relationships and in the culture that we reproduce in the diaspora context. And I wonder what some ways we can actually do to, I mean, young people ask me this all the time when they're talking to their parents about things like the expectation to get married. And, you know, how do you confront that in a way that is both informed by these larger practices of feminism or, you know, confronting gender violence and gender harassment, and at the same time, do it in a way that doesn't totally ostracize you and make you feel like you're no longer a part of your own family or your own community. I wonder if you can comment a little bit about that, because I think that's on people's minds.
I think it's hugely on people's minds. I mean, and, you know, there are a couple of wonderful people, well, many wonderful people here, but a couple in particular, we've had this conversation quite a bit about, you know, supporting our students who come to us with those kinds of questions. You know, how do I talk about this in my family? How do I confront, you know, the homophobia or patriarchy? And, you know, and I mean, this is very fraught and very tricky, but we have to do it. We have to have these conversations, and we have to, I think, talk to our students about, you know, what they might need, what kinds of support they might need. Not to say that everything, you know, just having a conversation is important, but I do think, you know, sort of being in solidarity with them, telling them they're not alone, sharing our own experiences of what we thought wasn't a possible conversation in our family or community that actually did unfold in a certain way. I think also, of course, emphasizing that not all families and communities are the same. There are, you know, different politics and individuals, and, you know, it's not that that patriarchy and homophobia are pervasive across class, race, immigrant communities, diaspora. But to really take your question seriously, it comes up. It comes up with our students, and I think I don't have a great answer except to say that I think it's a real question, and it should inform our teaching and our research. That's, I think, for me, why activism is such a generative place to look, because it shows us that these kinds of impossible conversations, or what you might think of as impossible, happen, and over time really do shape communities and societies and transform people in certain kinds of ways. It's not easy to kind of, or maybe even desirable to quantify that, but to, you know, look at those practices, those labors, you know, to look at the ways in which, you know, activists in Iran have changed the conversation around, you know, many questions around gender equality, so that this isn't, you know, certain things become normalized over time. And so it's a rambling non-answer to your question, except to say that I think it's a really, really important question. And I think it's a great conversation to have across immigrant and diasporic communities and communities of color who face, I think, these particular intersections and complexities that some communities don't face. And to think together about, you know, what kinds of spaces can we create for each other and for our students to experiment and to talk together and to think about, you know, how to survive in these different situations.
Yeah, I agree. I think just the sharing of other stories is really important. It is really interesting that it's around the question of marriage that a lot of things kind of spark. I've sometimes asked students to think about, well, what is the ask here? You're being asked to perform, to put your body on the line in particular ways, or produce this emotional labor, or do this type of social reproduction. And what is the anxiety of the family? And is there really no other way than like giving up bodily autonomy to do it? Like, what is the worry really in your family, and how else can it be addressed? And I think it's hard. I think it's hard to create people who are trying to figure out their own identities to become experts on it and to explain it to other folks, where, you know, cisgendered heteronormative people don't have to come out to their families. And if someone is not that, and trying to figure it out, it's okay if they don't have the right words or they don't do it at the right time, because they're still exploring. You don't have to be the expert. You don't have to be the one to reassure all the time. You can, you know, maybe walk the path a few steps till you figure it out for yourself. But I think it is always good to remind people that our histories are much more complex and intersectional than you might think. I think because of the pandemic, I've been sort of graduated to holding more history that, you know, aunts and uncles and fathers and mothers used to hold. But now it's kind of fast tracked to becoming kind of the job of folks my age. And I think I'm closer to partition than some of the students that I teach, where I remind them that, you know, Muslims and Hindus and Christians used to live together, and not all brides wear red, because some of us are Christian and some of us are Muslim, you know, some of us wear white, some of us wear green. So there's just a lot of unpacking to do around religious affiliation and what is your inheritance. And I've been struck by, maybe this is immigration patterns, who gets a visa, but a rise in conservatism among my younger students, where I'm really surprised that there's so many things they don't know, so many Dalit leaders they don't know, it's really important to make sure that the history is diverse and multivocal and made visible, made material, in whatever ways we can, just so it doesn't turn out to be one story that maybe isn't even accurate.
Okay. It's 5:30 and we have about 25 minutes to have the audience pose questions and engage with the speakers. So I can't see everybody, but I might be able to see your names. Let's see. There we go. Now I can see you. So if you have a question or a comment, a brief comment, you can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat and I'll try to make sure that you get a chance to say something. Is there anybody who wants to? I see a hand up. Okay. Let's see. Is that Azza? No. Why don't you just speak? Because I can't seem to, I see one hand up, but I don't know who.
Kevin.
Oh, Kevin.
Hi there, how's it going today?
Yeah, good.
I'm not sure if everyone could see me. Okay, perfect, yeah. Just to expand on that, I did take a political science class over the summer. I forgot the title, it was about refugees, I believe. And obviously, like, I believe like sexual act is a horrible act just to do and people should pay for it. But I also learned like maybe due to religion, a lot of like young girls don't speak up because a lot of their families might look at them as not like a virgin anymore, or they might get like raped and they get pregnant. So I just want to like clarification. How can we promote like a message as a nation to other countries? Like, like if a girl is raped, families shouldn't like look at that as, oh, like now they're not like a virgin, or we should, like we don't want them anymore, even though it's not their fault they got raped. So yeah.
Kasturi, did you want to respond to that at all?
Sure. Yeah, I think you've raised a really important issue. Thanks for your question. I do think that when there is a criminal act or violence, we usually don't blame the victim, and we don't see the victim as the one who has transgressed. And what is it about sexual violence, right, that is such a stain? And I think that what can we do except to maybe turn the tables and speak about the culture of rape and why that is, and what do different kinds of silences do around those acts. And I think that we have that problem across cultures, across communities, right? Like, what was the case in, was it North Carolina, where if you marry your rapist, then it's considered okay? So the age of consent is like kind of low in some states. And there is a sense, among folks that, well, then it makes it all okay. So I do wonder about how we think about rape. And although it's horrible, despicable, inexcusable act, I do also want to take this moment to say that it might not be the end of the world, that it might be something that you can stand up from and move on and have a life that is still yours. And I think that's an important message to say, that rape is survivable. And if it isn't, it maybe should be the rapist who carries the weight of figuring out what the act of rape meant rather than the victim.
Mahbube,
Thank you.
thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Catherine. Thank you. It was a very interesting discussion. And I noticed that you, Catherine, you have lots of things, you had lots of things in your talk. But one of things that was very critical for me was the connection between white feminism and between Iranian feminism, and how you see Me Too movement as a kind of a white discourse in Persian context, or you see some kind of like a localizing or decolonializing of this discourse, or generally if you see it as a white feminism discourse in diaspora context.
I mean, I think that there are certain kinds of representations of the movement and certain kinds of attention around the movement. And, you know, again, the kind of erasure until, you know, the last few years and particularly lately of Tarana Burke and other women of color feminists, you know, the crediting of 2017 with the kind of start of the movement. So I think that the kind of persistence of elisions and, you know, kind of racist understandings of this movement, that continues, and we have to challenge that. But from what I've kind of read and in talking to people and understand, it feels like, again, there are these kinds of parallel conversations happening, and that to kind of credit or think about it as a kind of white discourse, I think in some ways ignores the real conversations happening inside of different kinds of communities, and a kind of way in which also these communities are not, you know, totally cut off from each other, but that feminists are talking to each other across, you know, different racial, ethnic, national kinds of boundaries. So, you know, I think sort of moments like this and the kind of, you know, mass attention and kind of upsurge in these hashtag hybrid kind of movements make me nervous. And, you know, I think there's a lot to critique and there's a lot to kind of continue to unpack and understand. But, you know, there's interesting new work on, you know, just all the different places that this conversation is happening in tandem, you know, with what's happening in the US. So that's interesting to me. And I think, you know, part of it is, how do we tell the story of what's happening right now? And I think it is really important to emphasize that there is something happening in a lot of different places. There's a, you know, Me Too Mina, there's a Yemeni Me Too, there's an Egyptian Me Too, there's, you know, it's, you know, to what extent are these different expressions deeply connected to feminism on the ground is a really important question. I think we have to ask that, because, you know, Mahbubeh, and, you know, there are certain feminists in the Iranian diaspora that get a lot of attention and others that don't, you know, and we have to be, I think we have to navigate through all of that tricky terrain. At the same time, I think there, you know, there's something happening that feels worth paying attention to and trying to understand. And how do we then talk about the relationship between these different campaigns, upsurges, conversations, social movements, however we kind of want to think about them. So,
Hanum Sheikh.
Hi there. Hi, Catherine and Kasturi. And nice to be here. Um, my question is related to Mahbub's question actually, and it's about the way that the sort of specific discourse of rights travels transnationally, and particularly I'm thinking like in terms of Pakistan and the contemporary feminist movement in Pakistan. And some of the it's been very controversial, the women's marches in the last few years. And one of the reasons, I mean, they've been largely concentrated in urban centers like Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad mostly. And but some of the slogans that the feminists have used, are direct translations, for instance, of "My body, my rights." "Mera jism, meri marzi," and likewise many others that sort of very direct translations of conceptions of self and body and autonomy that are really deeply linked to the discourse of rights and sort of individual rights that have I guess worked well, in this context, to in the fight and the struggle for rights, but they've produced massive violent backlashes, and in the context of Pakistan, like absolute death threats and beatings, and also sort of an absolute what do you call it, like dismissal of the demands that these feminists are making in the streets. In urban centers. So I guess Catherine, in the beginning, one of the things you said that really struck me was how do the grammars of these movements translate into sort of, I think, something like our intimacies and our interpersonal relationships and our movements, I guess, too, localized movements as well. So I'm interested to just hear if you have any thoughts on that translation, the sort of epistemological sort of translations across contexts, and the Me Too that the Me Too has kind of produced, if that's clear.
I mean, I think it's actually a wonderful question, and I don't know that I could respond with something definitive, except as I think in trying to respond to Mahbub, I think there's something interesting going on, and there's an interesting. I mean, I don't know. I think the Iranian Me Too stuff is interesting because it's actually really not targeting the regime. It's the kind of focus is on, some, there have been high profile cases of celebrities and, but also, sort of ordinary people in the workplace, in life, in graduate school. So that to me is interesting because it shares some real similarities with other kinds of, Me Too discourses, right? Like trying to reveal again the systemic nature of patriarchy and sexual violence, and so I think in that sense it's interesting. I haven't seen a kind of similar discourse about rights, right? So I think you probably could speak more to the Pakistani case, but I think on the one hand, we can really kind of understand how rights discourse gets weaponized, and I think that's a really important critique. On the other hand, I think that the kind of particular vernacular articulations of rights, I think we have to unpack and dissect and kind of understand, is the struggle for kind of bodily autonomy. I mean, Shireen, our co-thinker Shireen Hafez, I think, talks about this in the case of Egypt, right? The kind of the corporeal performance, right, in these public spaces. Can we understand this as just a question of a kind of liberal individualism, right? Or is there something more going on something more complex about the ways in which that language gets taken up in these particular moments to mean different things. And so that's not an answer, just another set of questions, I guess.
Masa.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Hi, Persis. So good to see you all. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I just wanted to point out, so Catherine, something you said a couple of times, and I just wanted to, it caught my attention. It was sort of this discussion about the Me Too analysis in the sense of looking at the Me Too movement in Iran. It doesn't target the government. So I wanted to kind of just state this, the Me Too is not a new concept. I just think it gave a new name and opportunity for a tool in which people can tell their stories in a more collective way. I think that's the power. And for that reason, it has gone global in a way that's very powerful, because it's taken it away from the legal system or cultural system to the social consciousness conversation. And the more people name it, and I see that very much like the gay movement when the 1970s, Harvey Milk came out and said, come out wherever you are, because when you name it and then we have faces, it's really hard to ignore it. And I think in a society, laws are not absolute. They are there to be changed with the social consciousness. So I think that's the strength in the Me Too movement that we are experiencing. But this interesting thing you said about how the Me Too in Iran, in particular, that I'm interested in, because that's my area of attention these days, it's interesting. You said it's not a movement about the government, and I think what happened is a sort of this issue of the patriarchy and sexism and abuse is not new to not just to the cultures in the Middle East, but also in this country. It's not a new concept. It's just a very, but the laws are very different. The rules and social norms are very different. The thing that was really fascinating for me this summer, or actually, maybe it was spring, when the Me Too movement moved from the Iranian identity that we all kind of think about, it's just back home, and it moved to the diaspora in Bay Area, actually, and East Coast. What was really fascinating was this aha movement for a lot of us who are in diaspora, realizing that we actually didn't realize that misogyny had been transformed into our culture in the diaspora. And we had never really dealt with it. And we had never, because we always thought of something back home. Because over here, everybody's so intelligent and cool, and they talk about everything. And we weren't paying attention. And when the Me Too happened over here with our own community, it was heartbreaking. I think it was a moment it was very complicated and very, very difficult. So the point that you make about it not being about the government, because the reality of it is I in my experience personally, and I'm an attorney, and I've been trying to deal with this because I feel part of it is like the law doesn't cover all of this. So we're trying to figure out how to deal with all of this when the law is not made to deal with sexual harassment. It wasn't intended to be doing that. Anyhow, but it was interesting that you said doesn't, and I can see why it doesn't deal with the regime, because it's not a regime issue. It's really an issue much beyond the regime that we deal with today. And again, thank you again for all your time. And I love to hear your feedback on that.
Well, I just would thank you for your comments and participation. And I mean, I think my point about it's not targeted. The regime is like there's a certain different flavor that feels to me what's going on than some of the previous activism, although I think it builds on the conversations that have been happening in different kinds of ways, partly about the law and legal structure, but partly at the level of, I think the kind of consciousness raising. I mean, the 1 million signatures campaign, was having really, I think, deep kinds of conversations about gender and equality and patriarchy and the family and society. So again, I think it's both connected to some of those conversations, but it has maybe a different character of kind of strategy or or maybe strategy actually isn't really part of it. So I appreciate your comments, and I think, you know, one of the things that I emphasize in my book and talking to activists in the diaspora about their experience trying to organize in the diaspora was, you know, their kind of insistence on really, again, making connections between the kinds of sexism that they experienced in Iran, but also in a new context, right? Really understanding not just members of their own community, but US culture is deeply sexist and patriarchal, and, you know, in ways that were very striking to them. And I think, you know, that I think connects up to some of what you're kind of saying. But anyway, I appreciate your comments.
Asa, you had your hand up. Do you want to ask something?
Sure, I'll be quick about it. Thank you, Persis, Catherine, and Kasturi, for a really exciting and important conversation, right? I'm just thinking of the way in which Me Too travels. I work in the context of Malaysia. I worked on Malaysia, and the kinds of conversations that I've seen happening is the way in which the power to legislate is put back into the hands of the state, right? With the conversations about Me Too, the women's movements, activists, right, have sort of like taken a backseat in terms of the ways in which it's phrased in a Malaysian context, is that sexual harassment, sexual violence is seen in the context of the workplace, the way in which it's discussed in public in the workplace. And so the government then has to regulate what happens, right? And this is separate from the public discourse or public discussions that's not taking place in relation to consent, because consent only happens in the context of marriage, is only discussed within the context of marriage, right? And so what's happening is, at least what I'm seeing, is that the power being reinvested in the state and the ways in which the state then continues to regulate or come up with new ways and new legislation in which to regulate women's bodies and these kinds of actions and practices, and even the discourse of consent, right? But it also has produced, I think I kind of mentioned, a backlash, right? So recently there was a bill that was proposed to protect men against quote unquote women's words, women's clothing, and the ways in which all these kinds of stories that have cropped up around Me Too, right, has victimized men, right? And so I'm just thinking of, you know, the translatability, right, and how the ways in which Me Too becomes really deeply complex. I know everybody has commented on that within the local context, right? And I just wonder, what are some of the ways in which we can then think about, you know, and you said this, Catherine, right? There's a lot of exciting discussions about Me Too happening in specific places and specific geographical spaces. And I also think that we're not seeing enough of that yet, right? And what happens when, you know, the state is gaining traction, gaining more power than power, you know, when the power goes back into the state.
I think one perfect example of what you're talking about is, like, here we are in this Me Too movement, and some of the most backward repressive legislation has just been passed in the Texas legislature to control women's bodies and to turn people into vigilantes to control women's bodies. So it's like ironic that, you know, the same thing you're talking about, Azat, is that the state, or in this case, the state of Texas, is actually creating legislation that does everything it can to undo women's autonomy over their own bodies. And we, personally, I worry for the next step, right? Which is, the next case is Mississippi. And of course, then there's the question of the Supreme Court. So, and rooted in that is the question of rape, right? Of course, because they're trying to basically eliminate even the exception of rape clause in abortion. So it is fascinating that on the one hand, we have this, like, we can point to this R. Kelly case as one example of a very long struggle of women of color to come forward. And then the case in Texas as this absolutely repressive and backward looking piece of legislation that invests state power in gender discrimination and gendered violence. Any other questions?
Can I just say one thing in response? As I think that's an amazing comment, and Persis as well. And again, you know, it is kind of thinking with an abolitionist framework helpful when we look at and talk about Me Too? Does it help us connect the dots between these different forms of violence and power and control? And, you know, so I guess that would be one question. And then, you know, I think my brilliant colleague, Laura Kong, made this point, which is, you know, that Me Too, at least in the US context, is getting, you know, separated from long histories of feminist struggle around sexual and other kinds of violence. So I think in, you know, the case of Malaysia and Pakistan and Iran and the US, it's so important to, I think, kind of trace and articulate and continue to, you know, map out, you know, the ways in which what's happening now are linked to these long feminist struggles, you know, different kinds of struggles that both have their own flavor and also connect up with other struggles in these different locations. So how do we kind of think about that in a long historical way? And yeah, how do we, what is our idea? I mean, feminists who work deeply in a way that I don't on sexual violence have been, including my other brilliant colleague, Mahalia Little, have long been asking a set of really hard questions and really generative questions about, you know, what is justice, right? When it comes to not only sexual violence, but violence, and what are the really interlinked causes of, you know, violence and precarity for women, for feminized subjects, for non-binary subjects, for all kinds of people around the world, which is not to kind of conflate them all, but to try to actually connect the dots and then think about, you know, the ways in which the state, on the one hand, I think we have to engage, on the other hand, is a really powerful, deep perpetrator of violence and control. So,
Kasturi, do you want to have the last word?
No, except to say thank you and for this opportunity to think about it and to think about Me Too as a point of departure. You know, what does it mean to make a claim about the individual and the collective in the same hashtag? And I think that it will be really great to collect more stories and more questions and think about turning our gaze to higher forms of power that are invested in gender violence. But thank you so much, Catherine. I learned a lot. Thank you so much, Persis, for this opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for being with us today. And in the chat, you can find the link to Kasturi and Julietta Hua's new book, as well as Catherine's book, Axis of Hope. And I hope you'll come to our next event, which is a conversation with Azarine van der Vliet Olumi, who's an Iranian American writer, novelist, who actually has a book that just came out, and it deals with gendered violence. It's called Savage Tongues. And thank you so much to our speakers, and have a good evening.